This tutorial will talk about the differences between popular and scholarly sources. Popular sources include publications such as newspapers and magazines, and scholarly sources includes publications such as academic journals. We're going to discuss the different criteria when distinguishing the differences between these publications by looking at criteria such as page length, authorship, pictures, advertisements, whether these publications constitute research, and lastly, its intended audience. First, let's focus on page length. You'll notice that most newspapers and magazines are no longer than 2 or 3 pages, so the articles are very brief. Of course, this is because newspapers come out every day, and magazines are typically published once a week, so the articles are not very long. In comparison to academic journals, typically these articles are anywhere between 10 and 20 pages. Authorship. Typically speaking, newspapers and magazines are authored by journalists or reporters who are paid employees of the organization. In academic journals, the authors are scholars or researchers who are typically not paid by the publication. Pictures. In newspapers and magazines, there's going to be a lot of pictures. Some might be black and white, some of them might be color, but there's a lot of photographs in a typical newspaper or magazine article. In contrast, academic journals do not have pictures, but they have a lot of graphs and charts. Advertisements. You will notice that newspapers and magazines have a lot of advertisements. But in contrast, academic journals do not have any or very little advertisements in their articles. Research. On the topic of research, newspapers and magazines typically disseminate the news and current events. They are not typically engaged in research. Of course, in contrast, academic journals are providing research. They are engaged in research studies, literature reviews, and the articles are much longer because they are heavily involved in conducting research studies. And you can tell with an academic journal because at the back of the journal article, there's an extensive list of references. Finally, last but not least, the intended audience. The intended audience for newspapers and magazines are usually the general public or specific audiences, such in the case of photography magazines, golf magazines, tennis magazines, or hockey magazines. There are specific audiences for those publications. But typically the newspapers, the intended audience is the general public. For academic journals, the intended audience are the specific scholars and researchers in those fields. For example, a nursing journal is usually intended for nursing students or nurses or other medical professionals. And a medical journal, its intended audience are usually physicians or medical students. So this concludes the lesson distinguishing the differences between scholarly and popular sources.